today's 5-minute families, we're going to cover the Fagaceae to begin with. Fagaceae is a really important family that includes Chrysolepis and Quercus. Chrysolepis is the genus for chinkapin, golden chinkapin, which is common on the east side, a really important shrub species. One that you might run into if you're out in the wilds there. So that's a really important one to know about. And then, of course, there's the oaks in the genus Quercus. And oaks are a widespread and diverse group of taxa. This genus contains a number of species that frequently hybridize with each other. In our region, there's really two big groups of oaks to think about. We have the white oaks and the black oaks, which we'll commonly run into. If you are lucky, you might get to run into an evergreen, the evergreen oak, Quercus chrysolepis. This is less common in the Northwest, but it is possible to run into it, so it's good to know about it. After that, Quercus garryana is probably our most common Oregon white oak, which you might run into. Quercus robur you could run into. As you go south, Quercus callagii is more common, getting into California. And then, of course, we have a couple other oak species that you can also run into that often will be, escaped from cultivation. Leaving the oaks in Florida, the Pacific Northwest, there are several other families of shrubs that are important to know about, including the Miraceae, which contains the wax myrtle, another species that's common as you go south or when you're out on the coast. So you can find wax myrtle in Washington, out in Grays Harbor County, for example. Nice plant to know something about, and you're probably familiar with it if you spend time on the coast. That's Morella californica. After we leave these families, the next family is also a family of trees that you may be familiar with, Juglundaceae. This contains the genus Juglans. And we have a couple species to think about here. Several of these are common, some of them escaped cultivars, and so those are important to know about. They tend to be one of the few groups of taxa that have well-documented examples of chemical inhibition of other plants underneath their canopies, which is important. Leaving the Juglundaceae, we get to the Betulaceae of the birch family. So you see this portion of the Pacific floor of the Pacific Northwest contains a lot of our tree families. The birch family, Betulaceae, contains corylus, or the hazelnuts, alnus, or the alders, and betula, the birch, all in the same family. These are all closely related. You'll see their leaf shapes are all very similar, and they all have very similar catkins housing the flowers, which is really, really very interesting to see. Within alnus itself, the male catkins are pendant, and you'll notice that in the spring, whereas the female catkins are woody, and they will look like little cones. Don't be fooled, there are actual flowers in there, even though they look like they have woody cones. Of course, we have a number of species in alnus, but there are a few that you're more likely to see. If you spend a lot of time out in the lowland forests, are of course the tree you're most likely to run into in the genus Alnus is Alnus rubra. But once you get up into the hills, you may start running into some of our other Alnus species. Some of our other Alnus species can form kind of thick thickets of shrub-like alders. Alnus incana, Alnus viridis are both known for this. Betula, or birch, is another really interesting genus, but it's a genus you may be tempted to confuse with alder, so it's good to get to know the species that you might be able to run into. Many of our birches, again, are escaped cultivars, and so that's important to know about, although we do have native species too. So be aware that those can occur. They may be more common in streamside locations, sometimes in east side locations. Corylus, of course, is a very interesting genus. This is the genus for filbert or hazelnut. And we have a couple species that you might find depending on if they're escaped cultivars like the European filbert, or if there are native species like Cornus cornuta. Finally, in today's 5-minute families, I want to cover Cucurbitaceae. This is the cucumber or gourd family, and it has a few really interesting genera. In particular, Mara, which can be a really interesting genera to find in waste places. Really interesting taxa there. This gets us out of our trees momentarily, but don't worry, we'll be coming right back. Let's take a close look at Mara. Mara oregana, otherwise known as manroot, is a fascinating species you might find in open canopy habitats. This can produce a large tuber underground, which can be several feet across, and so that's why it's been given the name manroot as a common name. Really interesting to find. The palmate leaves are very characteristic of the species, and so you're likely to find those leaves, and of course you'd have to dig to find the root.